Hi everyone, this week we're going to be talking about security policies. This video is going to cover local security policy, and the next few videos we're going to be talking about auditing, data security, Windows updates, and a few other Windows security settings. Now, local security policy is a smaller part of a larger management system called group policy. Group policy is usually handled by Windows servers, so we're not really going to cover it in this class. We're going to be focusing on local security policy. Now, local security policy means the physical machine that you are on, the local machine. Every machine has a local security policy, and these policies are essentially rules and configurations for how your system works and who's allowed to do what, what's allowed to do what on the system. So let's get to the local security policy. If we go down to the Start menu, Control Panels, then System and Security, Administrative Tools, and then finally the local security policy. So this is the series of all the rules and configurations we have, 9 different sections of policies. We're going to just deal with a couple of them. So let me go over a few of the basic policies. First one is the account policies. Account policies has 2 sections, password and account lockout policy. They're pretty straightforward. Password policy is the things that you can do to enforce specific password requirements. So maximum age, if your password expires, it's going to expire after 42 days. Minimum length right now is set to 0, but passwords must meet complexity requirements. If this is set to enabled, I've set mine to enabled, this means that any password that you make must comply with Windows complexity requirements. Explain tab will explain what those are. So these are the password requirements for Windows machine. So you can't have a user's account name or parts of the user's full name, or up to 2 characters. They have to be at least 6 characters in length and have 3 of these 4 categories: uppercase, lowercase characters, base 10 digits, 0 through 9 basically, or non-alphabetical characters. So 3 of these 4 categories, 6 characters in length, and nothing to do with your account name or real name. That's what you need, the rules you need to follow to create a password on this particular machine. Different machines are going to have different settings. The account lockout policy is if you have lockout enabled, in other words, after a certain amount of incorrect logon attempts, which is set right here, right now it's set to none. If that happens, then the account that you're trying to log into gets locked out for a set amount of time, which is set in this policy here. And then the user will have to get it reset by the administrator or until the lockout duration ends, and then they can try entering again. This is a security policy used to try and prevent people from just sitting on and guessing someone else's passwords. And so this forces you, if you get a number of passwords wrong, you have to wait a while before you can try logging in again. So that's account policies. Local policies has 3 sections. The audit policy, which is going to be covering auditing rules. We're going to talk about auditing in the next video, so I won't mention any more here. The user rights assignment, these are policies, I should say, that allow users access or permission to certain parts of the system. This is, if you remember from last week, let me pull up computer management so I can get to my local users and groups. These groups, as I was saying last week, allow us to, if we put a user in these groups, they have specific permissions that they inherit by being members of these groups. For example, the backup operators group. If you are a member of the backup operators group, you can back up files that you normally would not have access to, system files, other users' documents, things like that. You don't need to be an administrator, you just need to be in the backup operators group, and you have the permissions to do that. Well, where do we get those permissions from? We get those permissions here in the local security policy. So, for example, right here, the backup files and directories. Who has access to this? Who is able to back them up? Well, administrators and backup operators. So this is where that group earned the ability to be able to back up files that they normally didn't have access to. And there's a ton of things like that, a ton of different policies that are user-specific, things users are able to do. For example, change system time. Only an administrator is allowed to change the system time as a user. The local service, anytime you see something like this in all caps, This is implying this is part of the operating system. So the operating system has a time service that is able to change the time, which is how your clock is able to stay in time. If the computer syncs to some external server, some time server, it can get the time for you, or someone in the administrator's group can manually change the time. So those are the kinds of things you have in user rights assignment. Now, security options. These are things that are, I guess, don't fall into the other policies, but these are policies that are related to security of the system. So, for example, we have an option here that restricts CD-ROM access to locally logged on users. What this means is that if you were a remote user, if you were logging into the machine over the internet from somewhere else, if this is enabled, you would not be able to access anything in the optical drive of the computer. Why is this? I'm sure someone thought of some security hole that way and they decided to create a policy for it. But that's something that you can define. Notice a lot of these security settings are not defined. These are optional settings that if you want to add to your system, you can. Going down here, a couple of other more popular policies. The interactive logons. This is how we log on to the machines, which we kind of went over last week. Well, one thing we can do is set how long a machine is allowed to be inactive before it locks itself out. So basically, I can set a set number of times, set amount of time that a machine can be idle, that you could not be using the machine before it locks and you have to type your password in order to access your user account again to be able to use the machine. This is a very common security policy. A lot of times people get up away from their desk for a few minutes to go get something to drink. That's a few minutes that anybody can come sit down on their computer and do something. So having this interactive logon built in, have it basically shut the machine, lock the machine down, I should say, if you leave for however long, it is a good security policy. Now, if you have this set to low, like say 10 seconds, that means someone will be reading an email, not touching anything, and then the system locks them out. And that's not very helpful. You want this to be a reasonable amount. A lot of companies that I know have a 5-minute lock. So if your machine is sitting idle for 5 minutes, then it will lock the user out and you'll have to hit Control, Delete, and relog in. Another popular setting, and one we'll talk about how to access in a rather easier way, is the user accounts control, the UAC settings. Behavior of elevation prompt. This is when you try and do something and it pops up that screen saying, "Are you sure you want to do it?" That's what these are. And so we actually can set how to do that, how and when we want UAC to prompt, and how we want it to prompt. So there's actually a user accounts control area in settings that we can use to make these changes. And when we make the changes in that control panel, it changes the policy here, it changes the rules here. So we'll deal with that in a later video. But those are the security options. And again, you can see there's a ton of them. A lot of them are network-based, but there's also some local machine-based policies as well. After local policies, there are a number of network-specific policies: Windows firewall configuration, network list management. We're not going to talk about public keys until we talk about networking, specifically interacting with servers. Software and application restriction, on the other hand, we can talk about. So these restriction policies, let me pull it open here. There we go. Focus on the app locker. App locker is a way for Windows to define what users are able to access or not access certain applications. Like, for example, say I found Bob is using Internet Explorer a lot, and I don't want Bob using Internet Explorer because Internet Explorer has security holes that I don't want to deal with. So I'm going to stop him from using Internet Explorer. How am I going to do that? I'm going to create a rule that will basically not let whoever I ask it to, not let them run a program. So let's do an executable rule. Executable rules are for programs. Windows installer rules, we can stop people or limit who can install things on Windows using Windows installers. And then script and packaged app rules are for scripts that would run or specific packages of applications if you try and install suites and have pre-configured application packages. So let's do an executable rule. So in executable rules, we don't have any yet, so let's create one. Right click in this area, create a new rule. Now the new rule wizard comes up, and we basically can follow the prompts to get our rule created. So what I want to do is I want to not allow, but deny a specific person who, well, Bob, that's who. I'm going to deny Bob the ability to run Internet Explorer. So right now I'm denying Bob. I go to next. Where am I going to get this? I could deny Bob use of all Microsoft products, but that might not be helpful. I still want him to get online. Edge is fine. I just don't want him to use Internet Explorer. So I'm going to specify the path. In other words, I'm going to find where the Internet Explorer program is on the computer and block that path from Bob. So where I'm going to browse for Bob. Internet Explorer. Yeah, I looked right at it. And iExplore. This is the Internet Explorer application. So I'm going to say OK there. Now, Bob is being denied access to the Internet Explorer app. Hit next. And do I want to add any exceptions to this rule? If I had, for example, I allowed everyone access to something, but here I want to deny specific users, I could do that. I could say, give everyone access to Internet Explorer and then except Bob. If I wanted to, I could go that route. But we'll leave that blank. And I'm going to give this a name. No IE for Bob. So now I know what this rule is. So I'll create the rule. The default rules are not the rule list. Yes, let's create some default rules. Whenever you have a rule, this is a rule that is not the same as the default rules. If you have no default rules created, Windows asks if you want to create them. And then if you can see here, all it's doing is saying, let everyone do everything. So these rules are really, there are no limits, there are no rules. And then I can add my rules after that, because that's the way policies work. You start by defining what is available, and then you lock down what is available. So now, if I actually run these, if I enable App Blocker, this rule is going to be applied. So let me go to App Blocker and configure rule enforcement, because right now I haven't turned it on yet. I've just defined the rules. So here, these are the 4 different sets of rules that we were looking at earlier. I have an executable rule, I have them configured, and we are now going to enforce the rules. So if I apply. So now that I've applied this, I have an executable rule that's now being enforced. Bob is not able to access Internet Explorer anymore. Yay me, okay. So those are the kind of things you can do with App Blocker. App Blocker is not foolproof. There are ways around it, but generally it's a good starting point for controlling the access of certain applications and installers from the typical user. So that's a brief overview of the different policies that we are going to deal with today. The auditing and advanced audit policies we're going to deal with in the auditing video, and the rest of our network policies that we may touch on in our networking section. Now, one last thing I want to talk about with these policies is that they are transferable, they are movable. So this policy, this whole list of configurations, this is something that can be saved, save all these configurations in what we call a template. And that template could then be used on other machines if we wanted. So if I, for example, have an office with 7 or 8 different machines, and I want the same policy, the same sets of security rules on all of these machines, what I can do is I can configure one machine with these policies, then save that configuration, and then apply that configuration to all of the other machines. To do that, I can go up here in, oops, let me get this, uh-oh. There we go. So that's it for the policies that we're going to discuss in this lecture today. The ones we haven't talked about yet, advanced audit policy, we'll also be dealing with in the audit section. IP security, network, list management, Windows firewall, those are all network settings that we'll deal with perhaps when we talk about networking. One last thing I want to mention, though, is that this set of rules, this policy, is something that can be saved and brought to other machines. Say you have a company with 7 computers and you want them all to have the same settings, the same rules. Well, you can configure the policy on one machine, then save that as a template, we call it. This would end up being a security template. And that template can then be copied over and imported on all of the other machines. So you basically only have to do the work once and then just copy it to other machines. So to do that, we go up here to Action. And in Action, we have the ability to import and export policies. So if I wanted to export this policy, if I got it all configured the way I wanted, I click on Export Policy, and I'm going to give it a name. It's going to be an INF file. INF is a security template. So call it my policy. If I can spell policy correctly. There we go. So my policy, I save it, and then I can now take this INF file that I am saving, bring it to another machine, and then import my policy. I would select that, I would import it, and it would then write all of the settings that I have configured on this machine on all the other machines. So it's a nice management system technique that we can use to minimize the work. We don't have to go and make changes to every machine. We make change to one machine, and then we can take that and apply that to everybody else. So that's going to cover the local security policy information for this week. Next video, I'll be talking specifically about auditing and auditing policies.